Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from officials in what was the Department for Communities and Local Government. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
So, thank you. May I call Louise Upton?
Thank you.
Stand behind the chair.
Good morning, Ms. Upton. I gather you're going to affirm.
I am.
Right. Well, the words are there on the screen. Would you read them out, please?
Yes. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Now, please sit down and make yourself comfortable. All right? Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Sir, thank you. First of all, would you please confirm your name for the record?
Louise Upton.
Thank you. Ms. Upton, thank you for attending today to give evidence. It's much appreciated. Now, I shall try and keep my questions short and simple. If I fail in that, please say so, and I'll correct that error. Secondly, if at any time during your evidence you feel you need a break, please say so. That's not a problem. Thirdly, could I ask you, when you're giving evidence, to keep your voice up? The microphones simply record what you're saying. They don't amplify your voice. Now, you have produced two witness statements for the purposes of this inquiry. Could we go to the first one, which is a HOM 000 46040. And if we could turn to page 23. We see it's dated the 12th of December 2018. Is that your signature above the date?
Yes.
And your second witness statement is at HOM 000 50082. And if we could go to page 28. Again, we see it's dated the 1st of September 2021. Is that your signature there?
It is.
Have you read both of those statements recently?
Yes.
And are their contents true?
Yes.
And there are a number of exhibits to both those witness statements. Have you reviewed those exhibits recently?
Yes, I have.
Thank you. Have you discussed your evidence with anyone here, with anyone before coming here today?
No, just my legal team.
Thank you. Now, the first topic I'd like to discuss with you is your professional background. Now, you began your career in the civil service in the then Department for the Environment in March 1988. Is that right?
Yes.
And in 2004, you joined the Fire and Resilience Directorate, which was then part of the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister. Is that right?
That's right.
And was that the first position you held which concerned or touched upon fire safety policy matters?
Yes, but in 2004 it wasn't a fire safety policy role. It was more a directorate support role, running the programme looking at fire reform that came into the MHCLG at the time.
Now, in 2007, you joined the Fire Safety Policy Team, which then sat in the Department of Communities and Local Government, and you worked mainly on policy issues arising from the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. Is that right?
Yes.
In April 2009, you were promoted to Civil Service Grade 7 and were responsible for the Fire Safety Policy Team. Is that right? And you and your team were responsible for the development, implementation and management of fire safety policies in respect of community fire safety, but also fire legislation. Is that right?
Yes.
And fire safety legislation, including the 2005 order?
Yes, it was entirely the 2005 order.
And also, is it right that you held particular responsibility, in your own words, to ensure that the wider fire policy agenda within the Directorate and across government was coherent and reflected the role of the fire and rescue authorities and others in delivering safer communities?
Yes.
Now, if I could look at the size of your team, is it right that between 2011 and 12 and 2015, you were essentially a team of three, so yourself, an SEO and an HEO? Is that right?
Yes.
Now,
Sorry, did you want to add to that? You looked as though you might.
Yeah, only to say, which was in my statement, that we had seconded support from a serving fire officer who came in to support the work of the team for a period during that time.
I was going to come on to that next, but if we could just deal first of all, what is an SEO and what's an HEO?
A senior executive officer is an SEO, and a higher executive officer is the HEO. And so the HEO reported to the SEO, and then they both reported to me as the grade 7.
Thank you. Now, you touched on this earlier, but in 2013, you had additional resources from a member of staff seconded from a fire and rescue service. Is that right?
We did, yeah.
And who was that?
That was Andy Stapleton from Essex
And
Fire and Rescue Service.
And how long did he stay with you?
I think it was about a year, maybe 18 months.
And then did you go back down to your core team of 3?
Yes, briefly, and then we lost one of... Then we were a team of 2 after that.
Now, until January 2016, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government was ultimately responsible for fire safety policy, but day-to-day responsibility was held by a Minister of State. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Sorry. I'll stop nodding and talk.
Don't worry. If you can say yes or no as the case demands, then the transcriber can catch what you say. Now, after January 2016, responsibility for fire safety policy, and presumably your team also, was transferred to the Home Office. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Now, we don't need to go to it, but in your statement, you say that in relation to the transfer of national fire policy to the Home Office, that, and I quote, "I was keen to see that the linkage of the FSO," that's the 2005 order, "to the fire safety elements, Part B of building regulations, along with the technical expertise that was available on practical fire safety matters, was maintained. I propose that consideration be given to retaining the element of my team's work on FSO-related issues within MHCLG." Why were you keen to retain that link?
Well, I think it was quite clear that it sat uncomfortably within the wider Fire and Resilience Policy Directorate, which was looking very much at workforce governance issues. The legislation was unusual, I think, in terms of what the department did, in that it applied to businesses. The Fire and Rescue Services were the enforcing authority for the legislation, but it was very outward-facing to workplaces, business owners, responsible people. And the link with the building regulations is that building safety and fire safety management of buildings started essentially with how the building was constructed, and you based your fire safety management strategies around an understanding of the building. I came from a policy background. I didn't have any technical expertise at all in building safety, but I needed to talk to people in order to do my job effectively. I felt it important to understand more technical information, and if I felt that business owners and responsible people would also benefit from having that link between the building that they were occupying and the fire safety management strategy brought together more holistically than perhaps we'd done already. So it seemed...
Okay, thank you. Now, were you successful in maintaining that link?
Yes.
Now, and do you remain responsible for the fire safety policy team until what date?
Sorry, that's quite hard. I took a career break. Post Grenfell, everything changed quite significantly in terms of my role. So I haven't really thought about that so much. So it's hard to say when I moved on to more building safety issues, but I certainly took a career break from the beginning of August 2018. So I would say from there.
Thank you. Now, turning to formal reporting lines, is it right that you reported initially to Sandy Bishop and subsequently to Dawn Eastmead, Claire Cooper, Chloe Dunnett, and then to Rod McLean?
Yes.
And were they deputy directors?
Yes.
In brief, how did the deputy director oversee the work of your team?
We would have regular meetings, we would have work plans, action plans, we'd discuss priorities. I'd clear work through, my deputy director in the normal, the usual way really. We'd have regular meetings, we'd establish links between policies, we'd discuss how we were going to take things forward, we'd have regular reviews.
Thank you. Now, could you raise a particular issue with the permanent secretary directly if you considered it to be sufficiently important?
Yes, and I assume that would have been an option available to me. It would have felt a nuclear option, and I didn't feel that the relationships in the team, would have ever necessitated that.
So you never did? You never?
No.
Could you bring matters directly to the attention of the Minister for Fire if you considered that issue to be sufficiently important?
Yes, but generally through written submissions. But obviously, if you were in a meeting and something came up, you would obviously discuss it with the Minister as part of normal conversations, policy conversations. But generally, you prepared ministers with written work and a submission.
And apart from matters which, for example, by law required ministerial approval, in general terms, what criteria would you apply in deciding what issues to put before the minister?
Well, there was a general presumption that anything significant public safety-wise would go to the minister. We would put correspondence, reviews, we would provide advice on that. Or, in discussions, we'd say, well, this is a significant issue. We should cite the minister on this. We'd know what was coming up. So it would be a fairly flexible approach, but basically things that would come up in the course that the minister needed to know about in order to respond to parliamentary or business meetings or stakeholder conversations.
Could we describe it this way? In looking at what is significant for these purposes, you knew it when you saw it?
Absolutely, that would have been a much better way to say it.
Now, could we go look at Brian Martin's witness statement, which is at CLG 0019469/6 and paragraph 19, which starts on page 6. And we can see...
I'm sorry, that's perfect, could I just have it slightly larger?
Don't worry, they will do. What will happen, the document will come up, and then the document manager will focus on the particular paragraph that we'll be needing to look at, so don't worry.
Yeah. But if you can't read something, just say so, all right?
Now, looking at the last part of the final line on page 6, Brian Martin said this with reference to the building regulations. There is an important, if we go over the page, distinction between the fire safety for buildings in use, which is not within the scope of the regulations, and fire safety in the design and construction of buildings, which is within the scope of the regulations. And then if we look at the end of the third line at the top of page 7, he goes on to say this. These two areas of policy were delegated to two different junior ministers throughout my time in the department until January 2016, when the government decided to transfer responsibility for fire safety of buildings in use, as well as responsibility for the fire and rescue services, to the Home Office. Obviously, where there was a policy overlap between fire safety for buildings in use and the regulations, I would assist colleagues if the issue was within my expertise. Now, first of all, is that a fair summary of the position he's given there?
Yes.
What areas of policy would Brian Martin assist you with?
Technical policy on the building regulations, about which I knew very little. So what was required when a building was constructed, what would have happened when a building had been modified or changed, what the actual requirement was. He also helped me from a understanding how fire safety would be looked at, the bigger picture stuff, the connections between the various things that buildings required, and he understood the legislation and stakeholders' positions, because it was a small pool of fire safety expertise. We knew the same people. It was useful.
And how would these liaison arrangements work in practice?
Oh, fairly informally. We'd have a coffee, or we'd be at meetings together, or I'd send him an email, or he'd send me an email. He was a very supportive, open, constructive relationship with Brian.
Did those arrangements change following the transfer to the Home Office?
Yes, because our roles changed quite significantly. I think we became two different. We weren't part of the same department, so it did change. But I could still talk about issues insofar as they're related to buildings with him. We were still close colleagues.
Can you give the panel only a broad idea of the circumstances in which you'd seek Brian Martin's advice or guidance?
Well, when I wanted to test my understanding of things, or the approach I wanted to take, I wanted to understand the implications of that for a whole raft of people, including building owners and building regulations, and just to make sure that really the connection between the way the building had been made and how it was being managed, it was fairly. They were very, very closely linked in my mind, and there was very few independent technical people that I could talk to about things I was thinking might be useful to do or not to do. And
is it fair to say the impression from what you've said is that you greatly relied upon Brian Martin when it came to the technical matters arising from the building regulations, but also his advice and experience and expertise from the fire safety sector more generally?
Yes.
Was there any formal reporting line between you and Brian Martin?
No.
Was there any formal reporting line between you and, for example, the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor?
No.
Could we go to your first witness statement, which we find at HOM 000 460 40/3. And if we could look at paragraph 9 and the fourth line down. Now there you say, in that line, and I quote, "It also required close collaboration with experienced fire safety practitioners within the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisors unit." Now, first of all, on what particular matters would you seek advice from the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor?
I suppose it was more having conversations. So Ken Knight, as the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor, had technical support and in his team through Pete Wise. So I would more usually talk to Pete Wise, who was a fire safety, had done fire safety. He was a fire safety engineer and had done fire safety enforcement. So on how the order worked practically, I'd talk to Pete. But Ken was very engaged in fire safety and was very open and approachable and was a useful sounding board. So I can't remember specific incidents, but he was always available to chat about things too.
Thank you. Now, the second matter I'd like to discuss with you today is the document entitled Initial Evaluation into the Effectiveness of the Fire Safety Order. And if we could stay in this, your first statement, but go to page 4 and paragraph 14. Now, what you say there is this. One of the first projects that I was involved in on joining the team was the commissioning of an initial valuation of the effectiveness of the FSO, the findings of which were presented in a Communities and Local Government report entitled Initial Evaluation of the Effectiveness of the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, published on the 1st of March 2009. First of all, what was your particular role in that project?
It was the first job I did, I think, when I came into the fire safety team. The order had been in operation for about 18 months, and it was kind of good policy practice to see how it was really working out in practice. So my role was to commission the research company to carry out the project, the evaluation, to work with us to establish the scope, what we really wanted to look at, to draft the topic guides for the various sectors whose views we wanted to understand on the order.
And who carried out the research into the effectiveness of the order? Can you remember now?
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
So, who drafted the report?
The company who did the evaluation drafted the report.
Did you have any role at all in the drafting, or did you simply review the draft texts that were provided to you?
No, I played a fairly significant role in reviewing the draft and shaping the eventual report.
Now, if we can, bearing that in mind, stay with paragraph 14, and you go on to say this, and I quote, "This was intended, i.e. the report was intended, to assess how the FSO was establishing itself with the enforcing authorities, with responsible persons, and with the fire safety industry." What had prompted the review in the first place?
Just the newness of the legislation. I think it was the legislation was introduced, it was slightly delayed. The team that had worked on putting it together had been disbanded, and there was I don't think there was very much expertise left on what had happened within the department, on why the legislation was the way it was. So it's just good policy practice, I think, to take an early look at, is it working as we expected it to? Is there more that we might need to do to smooth it, because it was such a significant piece of legislation for everybody running a business or operating a workplace.
Who decided to set up the review? Was it at permanent secretary level, or was it at deputy director level?
I don't know the answer.
So beyond what you've identified, the report was aimed at giving an overall view of the effectiveness of the legislation, and there were no particular concerns about its operation. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's a fair summary.
Now, can we go to the report itself, which is at HOM 000 460 62/1. Can I safely assume that you read the report?
Yes.
Who was the intended audience?
I think policy officials at the department, but certainly other departments would have been interested. It was published, it was of interest to business, to fire and rescue authorities, the public, and to stakeholders. I think it was anybody with an interest in fire safety would have been interested in how this piece of legislation was embedding, I imagine.
Now, can we turn to page 8 and the executive summary? And the second paragraph on that page says this: following a series of scoping interviews with sector stakeholders, face-to-face and telephone depth interviews were conducted with, a series of bullet points now, 20 enforcers, primarily fire and rescue authorities, FRAs, but also the other enforcers listed under Article 25 of the FSO. Second bullet point, 15 representatives from the fire safety industry, including some third-party safety consultants, and third, 45 businesses split across a variety of sectors and company sizes. First of all, who decided the substance of the consultees? So who decided who was going to be consulted?
We would have in the policy team decided that.
And was the aim to get as broad a consultee constituency as was possible?
Yes, but within constraints. I mean, it was massive, the fire safety order, and so it had to be narrowed down, you know, within affordability constraints and time constraints. So, yeah.
Can we turn to page 11? And we see somewhere down the start of that page is the heading Responsible Person's Key Findings. And if we go over the page to page 12, you'll see just below halfway there's a heading Conclusions, but can we just look at the paragraph above that subheading, which says this: there was a concern expressed by some of those interviewed from each of the interested parties, whether enforcers, businesses, or the fire safety industry, over the variability in the level of competence evident in the work of independent fire risk assessors or fire safety consultants. This led to some demands for a system of accreditation to be put in place to quality assure the work of such organisations or individuals. Few of the responsible persons interviewed were aware of any independently operated accreditation schemes for fire risk assessors. Now, were you aware of the nature and extent of those concerns at the time the report was commissioned?
No, I don't think so. Because I think I just joined and really picked this up then. I think this was as much an introduction to me to fire safety issues as it was to everybody else.
And when you saw the draft of this report, were there any conversations amongst policy officials which said, well, that's a surprise, or alternatively, that confirms what we suspected, anything along those lines?
No, I think we did know that the order extended previous regulations, workplace regulations, so there was a cohort of larger businesses that were well used to, we understood were well used to delivering fire risk assessments in their premises, but it brought in a whole range of smaller, medium-sized enterprises and other type of premises for whom the duties to carry out risk assessments would be new. So we did want to know how they were coping with that and where they were getting the advice from. And there was obviously the government suite of guidance documents, so understanding how that had landed with the people it was intended for was of interest. And obviously the order's introduction, I think, created a industry of people who didn't have qualifications who were able to tout fire risk assessment services to new businesses or businesses that were brought within scope of the order. And so it was an opportunity. I mean, there was correspondence saying, I don't understand, do I really have to do this, as my fire risk assessor has told me to do this. So we did know that there were issues around it, and so it was, by putting in these questions, we were aiming to bottom out get some evidence around that.
Now, if we can turn to page 82. Here's the conclusion chapter itself. But if we could turn over the page to 83, where we see the emboldened text in the first bullet point at the very top of that page. And it says this: greater clarity about who may have an appropriate level of competency to assist with delivering compliance under the FSO and advice on how to access it. And below, in plain text, it said this: enforcers recognise that responsible persons may wish to use someone with greater fire expertise than themselves to carry out a risk assessment. They would welcome an agreed accreditation system. Some businesses and some in the fire safety industry would also welcome such a scheme. Generally, where responsible persons had used a third party, they tended to be happy with the quality and value of the risk assessment. Now, it would seem that certainly by March 2009, you and other policy officials were at least aware of concerns amongst enforcing authorities and some responsible persons about the competency of certain third-party fire risk assessors. Have I summarised matters fairly?
Absolutely.
Now, could we go back? Apologies, we're going to be jumping between documents, so can I apologise in advance for doing so? But if we can go back to your first statement, which is at HOM 000-460-40/5. And if we could look at paragraph 16 of your statement, you say this: following the publication of the report, part of the work of the team became focused on designing and implementing a programme of work to address these early findings, including working with a number of fire safety organisations to establish a process for ensuring and providing assurance of the competency of those providing commercial risk assessment services. What was the process you were seeking to establish there?
I think we wanted to understand, I think, from the sector of what scope there was to put in place a mechanism which would allow people who wanted to be risk assessors, if they wanted to be risk assessors, and to then take, to be able to evidence-base the fact that they had some competency to do the task in hand. The way it was at the moment, in March 2009, anybody could say, I'm a fire risk assessor. So we really wanted to talk to people who either were professional fire safety expertise or in the fire safety business, to just work with them to look at how we could collaborate to support responsible persons in identifying people.
And at that stage, is it fair to say that neither you or any other policy officials had any firm or developed ideas of what that process might look like?
Yeah.
Now, on the 11th of June 2009, you attended a Chief Fire Officers Association Enforcement Working Group meeting. Now, the minutes of that meeting can be found at HOM 000-12153. And if we could look at page 2 and paragraph 11 in those minutes. Thank you. Now you'll see paragraph 11, roughly halfway down the page there, the following's recorded. CLG, that's the department, recognised that the recent evaluation of the FSO had indicated that many of those affected by the order would welcome the availability of a nationally recognised accreditation scheme for risk assessors. Whilst this was not something that government would develop, the CLG were encouraging the industry and others, including CFOA, to work together to establish such a register to help businesses identify those with an appropriate level competency to advise on risk assessment under the order. Now, when had a decision been made that a nationally recognised accreditation scheme was, to quote, not something the government would develop, close quotes?
I think that comes back from when the order had been introduced, it was very clear at the time that this wasn't going to be a consultant's charter. So I wasn't involved in those discussions. I don't remember what deliberations were had around it, but certainly the government produced its own guidance to support the people it thought would benefit from having more detailed risk assessment, the small to medium-sized, low-risk premises. There was guidance documents for them. So I think because we were looking in 2009 at evaluating the effectiveness of the order, we weren't reviewing first principles of the order. Was it right? It was quite clear that, we couldn't easily introduce a mandatory scheme, so we were looking at how to make it work better and responding to business concerns, some businesses saying they would like to know who a competent risk assessor was.
Would it be fair to say, and please shout if this isn't, that you effectively inherited a presumption against a nationally recognised accreditation scheme?
No, I'm not sure. I think a mandatory, in order for there to be a mandatory system of risk assessor, you would have had to have something behind that. You'd have to have. So it kind of followed on from the logic of there not being any specification for what a competent person might look like. So you couldn't introduce legislation on the back of that. You needed to start with the principle of competency first of all. But there was no appetite from business to universally to have a competent, accredited risk assessor. So at the time we did this, we were looking to see how we could make the wheels of the order roll more smoothly for businesses who wanted it to, rather than introduce more legislation.
Now, can we turn to the third topic I'd like to discuss with you today, and that's the fire that broke out at Lakanal House in July 2009. Now, immediately following that fire, a report was published by Sir Ken Knight, who was then the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisor. Before we go to the report itself, dealing with the period up to that report, you say in your second witness statement at paragraph 7 on page 3, and the reference for that is HOM 000500082/3. At paragraph 7 you said this: my team, so the end of the first line, my team were thinking about how best to make progress on this particular finding from spring 2009. I can't recall what progress had been made, including whether any early advice had been put to ministers on either the findings of the evaluation or emerging proposals for acting on them. However, the Lakanal House fire on the 3rd of July 2009 and Sir Ken Knight's report into the emerging findings from the tragedy was a catalyst for focusing effort on this work. Now, is that another way of saying that between March 2009, when the initial evaluation was published, and July 2009, when the Lakanal fire broke out, that no substantive progress had been made on evaluating what needed to be done flowing from the initial evaluation report?
Yeah, I think we were thinking our way into it on top of, there were other things going on. I think we were thinking our way into how best we would do it, what resources we would need. But there was certainly nothing set in stone at that point. I think we recognised in a small team that it was a significant chunk of work which would require careful thought on how to deliver and what.
Could we go to your first statement again, HOM 000464040/5 and paragraph 17? What you say there is this: Although the team's priorities changed following the fatal fire at Lakanal House, which occurred on 3rd of July 2009, we sought to maintain progress on this work. How did the team's priorities change following Lakanal?
Well, essentially, I kind of became the coordination point of pulling together all of the work that was going on across the department in terms of housing, the fire safety order, building regulations, that whole kind of recovery piece of work, understanding what had happened, advising ministers daily. It became, what are we doing to address the issues that the Lakanal House has revealed, or, you know, a potential risk, in housing. And I kind of held the ring on, became the conduit, the one point of, single point of contact from everybody across the department feeding in. And I think it was the fire safety policy unit that coordinated much of the advice up to ministers, and obviously the order looking at the extent to which it applied, how London Fire Brigade had responded. It was a really big issue for the whole of the fire safety unit in terms of work.
Now, turning to the final report prepared by Sir Ken on emerging issues from the fire, we can find it at HOM quadruple 01092. We can see it was published on the 30th of July 2009. Did you or your team help directly with the drafting of Sir Ken's report?
No.
Did you discuss any matters arising from his deliberations, either with Sir Ken or with Peter Wise?
Yes, we would have stayed in touch. You know, yes, probably.
Probably, or you did?
Yeah, we would have. Yeah. It was
Did
the
you?
scope. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, if we can just follow through that, can we go to an email exchange from Peter Wise to Sir Ken? We can find it HOM 000 11 611. If that could be amplified. Is that okay to see, Miss Upton?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, we can see it's an email dated the 28th of July 2009, so 2 days before Sir Ken's final report on Lakanal was published. The opening sentence told Sir Ken that Peter Wise had had a, quotes, very full discussion with you about the FSO recommendation. First of all, do you remember that conversation?
No, I don't doubt it happened. I don't remember.
Can you remember the gist of that conversation at all?
No. But having read further, I can see it was around whether Sir Ken would recommend legislation.
Now, had you seen at this stage, so late July 2009, just before Sir Ken's final report was published, had you seen a draft text of that report before your conversation with Mr. Wise?
I can't remember.
Are you able to assist the panel? Was it likely that you would have seen a draft text, or can you not remember at all?
I suppose it's... Yeah, no, I can't remember. I think it was quite kept under wraps. I might have seen bits of it, but I don't think I saw the whole report.
Now, let's go further into this email and see whether this helps recollection or not. Peter Wise reported to Sir Ken that she, that's you, Miss Upton, is uncomfortable that any recommendations about legislation be made at such an early stage. I pointed out, that's Mr. Wise, that these are emerging issues and will necessarily have heavily, I think he means caveated, and that your report is independent. Now, Sir Ken's evidence was that he'd had in mind amending Article 9 of the order to place a duty on responsible persons to retain a competent person to carry out risk assessments of high-risk premises. Was that particular recommendation what you'd been discussing with Peter Wise?
Yes, I imagine so.
Were you uncomfortable with that recommendation?
Yeah, I think it was quite clear from the evaluation. I would have been quite uncomfortable because it was quite clear that not all, for the reasons we spoke about earlier, that it wasn't universal, that people wanted accredited risk assessors. It was working quite well for some. It was too early. I think we had already started working on the idea of what we could do to improve the situation for those that wanted to employ a competent risk assessor, and it felt, I imagine it would have felt premature, given how new the order was, to use that report
Was that view
to recommend legislation.
Was your view more broadly held at DCLG?
I don't think there was much appetite for more regulation or legislation at this point in time, because...
Was that appetite prompted by anything specific, i.e. a direction or instruction from a minister, or was it a general assessment that there was little appetite from the market for further regulation?
No, I think some in the market would have quite liked more regulation. There was always calls for more regulation. There was no push from ministers around more regulation in this space. And we also, at this point, hadn't had... I suppose it felt early, the dust was really... This was emerging findings on Lakanal. We just didn't know what had happened. We didn't know whether there had been a risk assessment. I think we didn't know whether there had been a risk assessment or who'd done it or the quality of that risk assessment. It just felt early, a month after Lakanal House.
And so,
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Gear. Can you just help me with this? I think we've seen from the earlier review of the order that the department had become aware that the quality of fire risk assessors out there in the market was a bit mixed, to put it at its lowest. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So what was the government's view on how that should be sorted out? Was it thought that the market would sift out the good from the not so good? Or what was it?
Yes, I think that's probably true, that it was early days and that the industry would deal with a lot of the issues that the order presented, but I think it needed the department to encourage that work. It needed some focus and impetus, perhaps.
But that would suggest that the department was content to allow a period to elapse during which at least some of the fire risk assessors operating in the market were not really up to scratch.
Well, we didn't have the evidence of that, I think. That was quite difficult, but certainly in order to have published the FSO evaluation report, ministers would have been aware and it would have been cleared. So they would have seen the findings. And at that point, I think we thought it was early days and the market could be encouraged to provide better.
It may be that it could, but it seems to me at the moment that the government was willing to allow a rather mixed bag of fire risk assessors to continue practicing.
Well, I think it made that decision when it introduced the legislation in the way it did. It was very, I wasn't involved at the time, but it was very clear that I assume people would have made the point, but the fact that the order was never intended to be a consultant's charter.
Well, I'm wondering in part how the responsible person, who is the person who must make or procure the suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, would be able to judge whether a particular person offering services as a fire risk assessor was competent to do it.
I don't know as they would. We provided guidance to help people so they could do it themselves, you know, with no other competence than the guidance document that was available from the government, but they could.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Clear.
Miss Upton, the decision or the view that it was premature to amend Article 9 appears to be formed by you rather than by a minister. Is that right?
Yes, me, and in discussion with, I suppose, my policy colleagues and my team.
So stopping there, if I can stop you, who were the policy officials and colleagues with whom you discussed this particular point in reaching the view that you did?
Well, it would certainly, I imagine, have been at least my line manager when we, and her line manager when we had the report. We would have thought, what would we do? Will we?
So it would have been the likes of people, Deputy Director level, Dawn Eastmead and the likes of her?
Sandy Bishop at the time, and yes.
But it wasn't something that was authorised or endorsed by ministers at this stage?
I don't remember putting advice to ministers with a choice.
And if you had, there would be a submission that would have shown?
Yeah.
And there isn't?
No.
Now, if we can go back to Mr. Wise's email, you'll see in the third full paragraph, he said this: her view, that's yours, is that any review of the legislation would be unwelcome. First of all, did Mr. Wise accurately summarise your view at the time?
I'm not sure about that, I suppose. I mean, we'd done the evaluation. We'd always thought it was intended to be a snapshot with a view to a formal review later.
But unwelcome to whom? To you, to ministers, to the part of industry? To whom?
I think to a lot, yes. I suppose to industry, we would have. I suppose I would have thought about it in the round. It was new legislation. It was bedding in. It needed time. We had a government that didn't particularly want more regulation. Certainly, the department wasn't resourced to deliver more legislation at the time. That's not to say we couldn't have been, had it been seen as sufficiently important. I suppose at the time, Pete and I talked about this. I'm not sure it would have been unwelcome, but it might have been premature.
What I'm sort of going back to is that clearly in the initial evaluation report, there are clear express reservations from some of those interviewed about the absence of competency and something needs to be done to address that.
Yep.
It appears, and correct me if this is wrong, that those views were disregarded for the reason that it was considered premature to substantially or in any way revise the order. Is that a fair summary in respect of Article 9?
Yes, I think we thought there were other ways we could address, potentially, working with the sector, the concerns that had been raised for those businesses that were asking.
Now, let's assume that Mr. Wise is broadly faithful in reporting your views on revisions to the legislation being unwelcome. Didn't that indication to Mr. Wise frustrate the purpose of asking Sir Ken for his views, which was to get an independent, ostensibly expert view on the emerging matters arising from Lakanal?
Well, I think it was a conversation that might have informed, but it wasn't a don't do this. I think it was a policy it was a policy conversation probably around bringing in the broader all of the issues that I've kind of touched on there to inform. I'm not sure I know from this what Ken's recommendation was. Assume it was to amend the order to require competent risk assessors. The complexity around that was there just wasn't that market even in place at the moment. There was no way there was no identified competency framework, so you were starting in the wrong place, or you'd introduce potentially without doing the work to get a competency framework in place. There was nothing to introduce that would be that helpful for business. So it kind of cart before horse, possibly.
But you were sending a signal, and I'd suggest a clear signal to Mr. Wise that any proposed revision of the order would not be looked on favourably.
At this point in time, on potentially, yeah, because it was so new.
So the answer is yes to my question.
Yes.
Can we look at the fourth full paragraph in this email, where the impression is that you informed Mr. Wise that, and I quote, policy have already proposed to get together with stakeholders to try and define what a third-party accreditation scheme would look like for risk assessors. This would tidy up this area in that it would fit with the government-led agenda to industry-led assurance. Had you told him that? So I've just...
Yes.
If I can just pause, I think the transcript may well have stopped working. It's back on, sorry. Had you told him that?
Yes. I mean, it was a clear recommendation from the evaluation, and we were working on it.
So Mr. Wise continues in the next paragraph along the following lines. If the recommendation is to review the FSO, we need to be aware of policy concerns. If we are concerned about competence, then policies present proposals may suffice, which could be captured in the following recommendation. Quote, a review should be undertaken on how the responsible person under the FSO can satisfy themselves that the suitability and sufficiency of their risk assessments is adequate, particularly where the premises is of higher risk and falls outside the scope of CLG guidance documents aimed at low-risk premises. This is particularly important where they may rely on employing someone else to undertake the risk assessment. Had you suggested that particular recommendation, as in those words or the gist, to Mr. Wise?
Yeah, that sounds quite likely.
Put bluntly, Miss Upton, what business was it of yours to interfere in the preparation of an ostensibly independent report from Sir Ken in this way, particularly in relation to recommendations?
Well, I think we would have discussed the if Ken's, I suppose we would have discussed what the intention of the recommendation was, which from this paragraph, which I'm sorry is a bit small for me, to review the FSO to make that one change would have been potentially disproportionate, and because I think we probably I'm not sure I drafted that recommendation for Ken. It would have been up to Ken as to decide whether to accept it or not, but it was definitely reflected the work that was ongoing within the team and might deal with Ken's particular concern in a more measured way than if his recommendation had been to review the whole of the FSO.
But the practical reality there, Ms Upton, I'd suggest to you, is that you were using back channels to shape and influence Sir Ken's recommendations, which were meant to be, certainly to the viewing public, independent. Would you accept that?
Well, we would have policy conversations to inform the recommendations, but I think Ken probably would have done that with a number of people to think about the issues that, were coming out of the fire.
Well, the approach.
But I can see.
You can see what?
How you may think that was influencing his report.
Now, could we go back to the report itself in the bottom half of page 11, HOM quadruple 01092/11. We see here the heading Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 and then a subheading Emerging Issues in italics. And the text said this: there is a requirement in the fire safety order to appoint one or more competent persons to assist the responsible person in undertaking the preventable and protective fire safety measures within premises. However, there is no similar requirement for a competent person to be appointed to assist in making a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. It is important that assurance be given to both the responsible person for the premises and the enforcing authority that a risk assessment has been undertaken by a competent person, particularly in relation to high-risk premises. Now, were you clear that Sir Ken considered that it was important that the responsible person should be assured that a risk assessment had been undertaken by a competent person?
Yes.
That was, in substance, the identical issue of competence that had been identified in the initial evaluation report, wasn't it?
By some, yeah.
And nothing had been done in the 15 months since the initial evaluation effectively to address the concerns about competence or at all. Would you accept that?
No, because the report was published in March 2009 and there was only 3 months before Lakanal House. Ken's report came out.
But nothing had been done in the intervening period?
Well, I think we'd probably had some conversation. Pete's email suggests that I'd reported back to him that we were looking at this. I just can't remember how far those conversations had got with interested parties in the sector, the gearing up that we'd done to look at what we might do. I think by the time of Lakanal House, we would have been working on an action plan. I'm just not sure that there's written evidence of how far we'd got with it. But
so it's conversations, but nothing had been reduced to paper. In short, is that the position?
Yeah.
Now, if we can go to page 12, and there is a box at the top headed Areas for Consideration, and it said this: consideration should be given to conducting a review as to how the responsible person under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 can be assured that their assessment of risk is suitable and sufficient, particularly where the premises is of a higher risk. This assurance is particularly important where the responsible person may be relying on using someone else to undertake the risk assessment. Where appropriate, the current fire safety order guidance should be amended accordingly. Now, did you understand that to be effectively recommending an amendment to Article 9 of the order?
No.
What did you understand that to be?
I understood that to be a recommendation that we looked at how to give responsible people assurance, and that once a way to do that had been established, we could include that in guidance so it was available for both enforcing authorities or responsible people to decide whether they felt able to do it, whether they were happy with the arrangements they'd already got, or whether they wanted to go to somebody different potentially.
Mindful of that answer, what steps were taken to implement the review commended here by Sir Ken?
So we acted fairly quickly. We were a very small team. I had discussions with my line manager, Sandy Bishop, and we agreed that we had some resource within the unit's budget and that we could employ a in-house. The department at the time had an in-house consultancy unit, which we obviously had to pay for, but there was resource available to do this, and it was a specific task. We could scope out a contract to bring in consultancy support to help us navigate with the sector how best we might consider the big question of what could be done.
Was revision or amendment of Article 9 effectively ruled out from the outset?
I'm not sure, because anybody could have said, well, no, this is so serious, we need to think about Article 9. Certainly, I didn't think that we needed to amend the order at this stage. It felt premature to me, but that's not to say that...
Or did anyone suggest revising, amending Article 9 as part of one of the options?
No.
Can I turn on to a separate topic now, which is the competency work plan? In September 2009, and after Sir Ken Knight's report had been published at the end of July, you drafted a submission on the competency of fire risk assessors to Sandy Bishop and Shona Dunn. Sandy Bishop was the Deputy Director to whom you reported. Can we go to HOM *0000612? We can see from the right-hand side that it was copied to, amongst others, Sir Ken Knight and Brian Martin. Why was a paper concerned with competency of fire safety risk assessors copied to Brian Martin, given that his responsibilities concern the building regulations?
I worked very closely with Brian on this. He was kind of technical, independent technical within the department advice. He was copied in because fire safety started with the building regulations, and so competency seemed to me started with an competency of a fire risker needed to understand the building regulations and how the fire safety could have compromised the basic principles of business regulation. It was.
Who was John Johnston?
He was a member of my team. Both he and Rhiannon Blackman were members of my team at the time.
Junior members of you. Were these the SEO and the HEO that we discussed earlier on?
Yeah.
Now, if we look halfway down the first page, we can see paragraph 2 under the heading recommendation, that you consider which course of action we should pursue to address concerns that those offering independent fire risk assessment services are competent to deliver a suitable and sufficient risk assessment as required by the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005. And if we could go to the foot of page 2, and you see there the emboldened subheading consideration, and the text underneath that says this: to date, ministers have confirmed that government has no plans to establish an accredited quality assurance scheme for those involved in the provision of fire risk assessments and other fire safety services. A number of professional qualifications exist in this area, and we and ministers have taken the view that the development of a nationally recognised scheme is best considered and delivered by the fire safety industry itself. Government has neither the expertise nor the resources available to implement and manage such a scheme. Bearing in mind what we discussed earlier this morning, when, if at all, had ministers last confirmed to you before September 2009 that government had no plans to establish an accredited quality assurance scheme for fire risk assessors?
Our ministers had never confirmed that to me. I don't think I had any meetings with ministers.
What was the basis, therefore, of you saying in a submission, to date, ministers have confirmed that?
Well, just going on to the next paragraph, sorry, it appears that there had been conversations with ministers around this. It's just that I was not involved in, it wasn't a conversation that they had with me, but that's not to say they wouldn't have had a conversation with my deputy director or the director of fire and resilience at the time. But it certainly implies that they'd asked, they'd been willing for us to engage rather than suggested regulation in this area.
But interrupt if this is wrong, but you yourself had not been involved in any discussions with a minister on this point, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And is your evidence that you were relying upon what had been reported back to you by others you can't identify in respect of conversations on dates you can't help us with about this point?
Yes, essentially, yes. I think I haven't seen the evidence, but there were conversations all the time between my deputy director, which would be fed, and other senior people, which would be fed back and inform the work of our team, my team.
Had there been, to the best of your knowledge, a specific confirmation from a minister, either the Fire Minister or the Secretary of State, following publication of the initial evaluation in March 2009?
No, we would have put it to them for information and for publication. I don't think it went with advice, what will we do?
And would it follow... Sorry, I interrupted you.
It would have gone with, we will be thinking about how we respond to the concerns that have been raised.
Had there been a confirmation from a minister since the publication of Ken Knight's report at the end of July 2009?
I can't recall, but that's not to say there weren't discussions. No, just not with me.
And so can you help us whether there was any discussion about whether the recommendation that Sir Ken made about the FSO had been discussed at deputy director level with the minister or someone higher than you?
Only from the evidence in this submission here.
But you have no independent recollection beyond what you're reading today?
No.
Can we look at the next paragraph where you say this? However, as the level of concern over this issue became apparent, ministers indicated that they would be willing for officials to discuss with interested parties the concept of a nationally recognised accreditation scheme for fire risk assessors. This led to some informal discussions with industry players, which indicated that there may be an appropriate leadership role for government in facilitating an exploratory discussion with the interested parties around expectations for any such scheme. Our stated aim has been to get a number of interested organisations around the table before the end of 2009. Having had the opportunity to consider how we might progress this in light of both the FSO evaluation and Sir Ken's findings, it is clear that there are a number of challenges and risks associated with CLG moving forward on this. There are therefore a number of key policy issues which need to be considered carefully, perhaps in conjunction with ministers, before progressing this further. First of all, had you been involved in any of these informal discussions with industry players?
Probably.
Do you remember with whom you had those discussions?
No, probably representatives from the FIA, Small Business, Federation of Small Business. I had a large list of stakeholders that I talked to from outside, but I can't remember in detail.
Can you help us? What was the nature of the leadership role that was anticipated for government?
I think the aim was to motivate the industry, support the industry, help the industry to develop a scheme.
You say there that there are a number of challenges and risks associated with CLG moving forward on this. First of all, what were the challenges?
Potentially resource, I suppose, and getting clarity of agreement, getting just even establishing a consensus approach, but it would have been time consuming and resource intensive, and ending up with something that people would want to use, I suppose, just whether we could develop a product that would be fit for purpose at the end, or encourage the sector to develop a product that would be fit for purpose.
What, therefore, were the risks?
That,
Are they much the same thing?
yes, I imagine they were, or, yes, or that it would become a government-owned scheme.
Now, staying on this page, you outline 3 policy options. 1, do nothing, leave the industry to address this for itself or maintain the status quo. 2, support industry in developing a scheme with encouragement, facilitation, and the possibility of some pump priming. Or 3, consider with ministers the appetite for establishing a government-sponsored scheme. What option was selected and by whom?
I think the second option was the preferred option, and I suspect that was a considered decision by the people that received this submission.
But you can't remember who precisely made the decision.
No.
Sir, that may well be an appropriate point at which to have the mid-morning break.
Yes, very well. Well, we have a break during the morning and the afternoon, and this is obviously a good time to take the morning break. So we'll stop now. We'll come back, please, at 25 to 12. Right, and now you've started giving your evidence, I have to ask you please not to talk about your evidence or anything relating to it to anyone while you're out of the room. All right? Good, thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you, 25 to 12.
Thanks, sir.
Would you ask Ms Upton to come back in, please?
Thank you.
Right, Ms Upton, ready to carry on? Thank you very much. Yes, Mr Kinnear?
Thanks, sir. Miss Upton, thank you. Now, you explained the work undertaken following the recommendation in your second witness statement at paragraph 9 and page 3, which can be found at HOM 0005082/3. And there you set out this. So this is following the options we were discussing before the break. As my team did not have the capacity to deliver the work that was needed to investigate and assess options with the sector for improving the competency of fire risk assessors, I agreed with my manager at some point between April and October 2009 that we would appoint a consultant from the department's in-house policy consultancy service, IHPC, to explore with representatives from the fire safety industry the scope for them to work collaboratively. The aim would be for the sector to develop a nationally recognised quality assurance mechanism for fire risk assessors and ensure a register of those with appropriate qualifications or certification was available to the public, i.e. business responsible persons. The IHPC was to deliver an options paper for consideration by senior managers and ministers based on the outcome of their discussions with the fire safety industry and professionals. Now, was it Jane Boys from IHCP who was appointed to lead the work?
Yes.
Now, if we can go to HOM 000122290, this is a report entitled Fire Safety Policy, Quality Assurance for Fire Risk Assessors, and the subtitle is Project Specification. Now, we can see on the first page the objectives set out for Jane Boys are summarised. And first, under the heading Objective 1, to explore with CLG and stakeholders their aspirations and the issues and concerns that would need to be addressed in any nationally recognised quality assurance scheme, including issues around accreditation and certification. Now, stopping there, it's a fair reading of that document that the primary aim of the exercise was to establish the potential content of a nationally recognised quality assurance scheme.
Yes.
At this stage, in October 2009, why was a nationally recognised scheme deemed appropriate?
Because it reflected the concerns that had come up through the evaluation, that there was an appetite within some in the responsible persons to have exactly that, a nationally confidence that they were appointing appropriately assured risk assessors to carry out their risk assessments.
If we can turn to page 3 and the bottom of that page, we can see that under the heading Clients, you're identified as a project officer. What were your responsibilities as the project officer?
To manage the project, to engage with Jane Boys and stakeholders, to facilitate the meetings, to ultimately provide advice at the end, to be the link person between the consultant and the department for the commission.
Looking further up that page, we see the heading Timetable and Output, and it says in the second paragraph this: a brief final report suitable for senior managers and ministers, covering the findings of the stakeholder discussions, details of the options identified and considered, and any recommendations will be presented shortly after. Now, who was to draft that brief final report for senior managers and ministers?
I think that would have fallen between the consultant and myself.
Was that final report ever produced?
Yes, in the form of a presentation.
We'll come on to that in due course. On the 14th of December 2009, there was a meeting between representatives of the fire sector and Jane Boys, and we have a presentation which for that meeting, which can be found at HOM 000 12752. Does this look familiar to you?
Yeah.
Turn to page 6 then, please. And if that could be expanded. This summarises the various existing competency schemes in the fire assessment sector. At the top of the page it says that a number of schemes have been developed by the industry. Some describe themselves as accredited. None has been widely adopted. There is no overall agreement within the industry. Did that, in a two-sentence pithy form, reflect your understanding of the state of play?
Yes, on the basis of the discussions that Jane had had with the stakeholders, I think that's true, yeah.
Could we go to page 12? And if that could be expanded. The yellow box at the top says this: CLG has an interest in ensuring that the regulatory reform order is implemented effectively. They recognise that progress needs to be made and are seeking advice on the way forward. We then see on the right-hand side concerns from stakeholders. Stakeholders, were they representatives of the fire sector, or was it more broadly drawn as a group?
Yeah, I think it was more broadly drawn. I think it included businesses and fire and rescue authorities.
Now, the bullet points on that right-hand column say this: ignorance among responsible persons about the requirements of the FSO, existing guidance is not user-friendly, too long for a simple case, inadequate for a complex building, not clear how CLG expect people to respond, many competing firms and schemes for assessors, but little transparency, confusing for customers. Among 4 in 10 audits in 2008-9 were unsatisfactory. Now, what was your reaction on reading that summary of the concerns?
I suppose not too surprised, but I think I'd need to go back to actually understand who had informed those concerns, who actually Jane had spoke to, whether they reflected the concerns from the industry, the stakeholders she was talking to, or whether she drew more widely.
But it is right to say, though, that these concerns reflected the concerns of some that had been reported in the initial evaluation. Would you accept that?
Yes, of course, yeah.
And am I right that it was at this meeting that it was decided to establish the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council in December 2009?
Yes, I think that is right.
And if we can stay in the presentation but go to page 17. The heading is Benefits of a UCAS Delivery Framework. The first bullet point says UCAS is an established government-appointed agency for accreditation. Did you consider that a competency framework which required UCAS accreditation of each relevant scheme was necessary and desirable to address the concerns that had been reported back?
I'm not sure I thought it was necessary, but I thought it was probably desirable.
Why, given the concerns that had been reported back, did you not consider it to be necessary?
Because I think at the time I thought it was possible for the sector to work together, to pull together a agreement that would be a sector owned, that wouldn't require, that would be credible and adopted by business without the need for UCAS accreditation. Because there was an overhead potentially in UCAS.
Well, could we, or is it fair to say that the benefit of UCAS accreditation was that it would bring together a number of disparate schemes and resolve the problem, indeed what appears to be a long-standing problem, that there was no overall industry agreement about what a competent fire risk assessor should look like.
Potentially, yes. Yes.
Could we go next to an email which was sent after that meeting, which we can find at HOM 000 3817. And at the bottom of page 1, we see the start of an email from you to Jane Boys, dated the 15th of December 2009. Copied in are Rhian Blackman, one of your team, Brian Martin and Peter Wise. What was Brian Martin's interest in the Boys review?
Well, we were I suppose overall fire safety of buildings. He was a technical expert with responsibility for building regulations, fire risk. He was a really useful point of contact and knowledge and expertise. I would have sought to involve him to make sure that the two policy sides aligned and that the outcome we were seeking to achieve with this was sensible and pragmatic and robust, and reflected the start of fire safety with the construction.
And does it go back to the fact, as we discussed earlier on, that you place great reliance upon his advice and guidance?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, you summarise the discussion in the meeting on the 14th of December that we've just considered, and at the first bullet point on this page, you say this: some of those present, notably IFE, RICS, BAFE, AFC, aspired ultimately to the development of a mandatory scheme under which responsible persons would be required to use accredited, quality-assured risk assessors, but meeting recognised that the current absence of any scheme meant it was far too early to think this far ahead. Why was it far too early to think that far ahead?
I think because the actually what a competent risk assessor would look like hadn't been established. So it was a kind of, it was an ultimate, it was where they wanted to get to. It couldn't happen immediately.
You've got some significant players in the industry there, IFE, RICS, BAFE and AFC. As you say, there seemed to be consensus about the end goal. Is that a fair summary?
Between these people, yes.
And yourselves, did you agree? Did you share that end goal?
Not necessarily that they would be required. It would be a statutory requirement for them to use this. I don't think we did share that. We weren't looking for a mandatory scheme necessarily.
We being the department, or we being the attendees at this meeting?
We being the department.
But it appears that certainly IFE, RICS, BAFE and the AFC did. Is that a fair summary? So government was the body to be persuaded, if I can put it neutrally, of the merits of a mandatory scheme.
Yeah, and ultimately business. That's what, because you would have had, yes.
Well, you've got quite some representative feeling for business in the bodies there, haven't you?
Oh yes, but not the people that would be required to use the mandatory services of a fire risk assessor. I think that was where a significant portion of the fire sector industry thought there should be mandation for their services to be used. I think business and responsible people, it wasn't as clear cut.
Well, we'll come on to that in due course. But turning to the second bullet point, you say this: government had no plans to require responsible persons to use third-party risk assessors. The work was in response to business aspirations to know where, if necessary, to go for appropriate help with their responsibilities under the FSO. Neither did we have plans to require all risk assessors to be quality assured. Experience suggested much could be achieved with a voluntary approach. How a responsible person chose to comply with the FSO was for them and would be picked up through FRAs, that's fire and rescue authorities. Sorry, yes, rescue authorities' audit and enforcement responsibilities. What experience had suggested to you? What were you relying upon when you said much could be achieved with a voluntary approach?
Because businesses weren't telling us they wanted more regulation. So what we wanted to do was to respond to their concerns, but in a way that gave them the flexibility to put in place their own arrangements, but have confidence that the people that they were using were competent.
So you didn't have, if I can summarise your evidence, you didn't have a particular precedent in mind. The hope for the voluntary approach was simply that, a hope. It was an aspiration, wasn't it, rather than anything more substantive?
Yes. But I think, yes, it was an aspiration.
Now, exhibited to your second witness statement, you exhibited a note of the meeting, which we can find at HOM 000-50090. This is the meeting on the 14th of December 2009. Can you remember who drafted this note? Was it you or someone else?
I can't remember.
Could we turn to page 3 and look at paragraph 7? It says this: the meeting agreed that the proposed Fire Risk Competency Council should aim for UCAS accreditation. Any voluntary approach was likely to perpetuate current confusions about who was competent and what this means. UCAS confirmed its support for the approach being outlined. Similarly, BAFE recognised the value of this approach and sought to ensure the requirements of companies employing fire risk assessors who act as consultants were reflected. They confirmed willingness to play a significant role in running and maintaining any schemes. Now that paragraph makes it clear that there was little, if any, support for the voluntary approach. Is that a fair reading?
I'm not sure it is, actually. I think they would have had to voluntarily agree these schemes to have to go to UCAS together, I believe. So the fact it was a UCAS accredited scheme didn't necessarily mean it was a mandated scheme. You could hold the two together. You could have a voluntary scheme with UCAS accreditation, I believe, because that's, once you'd agreed the principles of what a competent risk assessor was, those schemes working within that could be competent.
Miss Upton, the paragraph says this: any voluntary approach was likely to perpetuate current confusions about who was competent and what this means. That's clear, isn't it, as to what the view of the attendees was?
Yes, that is clear.
What your answer tends to suggest, if this reflects what you thought at the time, that you were anxious, almost keen, to invent reasons not to go down the UCAS route. Is that a fair observation?
No, I think we would have liked a UCAS approach. I think what I'm not clear about is that had it been a UCAS scheme, it would have made it mandatory. It would have just given transparency to businesses that those certifying the competency of risk assessors had. The processes behind that would have been robust.
Well, let's look at page 4 of this document. And we see there, top third of the page, the heading Outcome, and a number of points set out thereunder. The first is, and I quote, to consider an overarching set of criteria against which to assess competency of risk assessors, under which all existing schemes could sit. Now, looking at that phrase, under which all existing schemes could sit, can you recall now how it was envisaged that the criteria would work in practice?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
The second point says this: UCAS accreditation would be the basis of the scheme. Why had the parties agreed to UCAS in particular?
I think because possibly they already had, or some of them already had UCAS accreditation, but it was seen as an independent assurance of quality.
Presumably the best available.
Yeah.
Can we go to paragraph 31 of your second statement, which we find at HOM 0005082/9. And we see there in the third sentence, it's the fourth line down, you say this: the main priority at the beginning was to start to develop a consensus around what competency may look like as the basis for a competency standard. I recall it being a very controversial process with a range of interests at play, which took some time and effort to work through and coalesce around a single objective. I suspect at the beginning, the issue of UCAS accreditation may simply have been parked in order to preserve as far as possible a working coalition across the sector. The impression from this minute, though, of the meeting of the 14th of December is one of unanimity rather than dispute. Is that right?
Yes.
So UCAS accreditation does not appear to have been parked. The parties seem to have endorsed it without qualification. Is that right?
Yes.
Can we turn to paragraph 37 of your second witness statement, and it can be found at page 11. Thank you. What you say there at the start is this: I think I'm likely to have recognised there were significant issues for the professional bodies and that UCAS accreditation was not necessarily appropriate for them. Now, that observation is difficult to tally with paragraph 7 of the note of the 14th of December 2009. Do you accept that?
Yes.
Can you help us, therefore, as to which professional body you had in mind when you wrote this sentence in your statement?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
Can you help us as to why you'd apprehended that UCAS accreditation was not necessarily appropriate for these unidentifiable professional bodies?
No, I'm afraid I can't. I'm sorry.
You continue in that paragraph thus: it would have been inappropriate if the outcome of the work of FRAC and the government's engagement in it were to be considered, whether in practice or perception, disadvantageous or unfair to professionals operating in the field, a potential distortion of the market, or by promoting a restricted choice of service providers, i.e. those providers with UCAS accreditation, to place an unnecessarily high cost burden on business responsible persons. Now, what work had you done to determine that an unnecessarily high cost burden would be the consequence of requiring registration with a UCAS accredited scheme?
Well, we were being the Federation of Small Businesses.
If it helps you, my question was, what work had you done?
I'd
to satisfy
only
yourself?
engaged, yes, we hadn't done an impact assessment of any of this. We had just taken views from sector representatives and business, and from the fire sector, who said that there was a cost attached to UCAS accreditation. Going through that process and getting it was not necessarily for all businesses. And I suppose we wanted to.
Had any of the people with whom you consulted produced anything that could be described as a cost-benefit assessment?
No, not as far as I recall.
What did you do to critically analyse their assertions, if this is what they did say, that there was an unnecessarily high cost burden flowing from UCAS accreditation?
Nothing, I'm afraid.
So you parroted the assertion. Apologies for putting it bluntly, but does it amount to that?
Yes.
So no critical scrutiny at all was applied by you in making this observation?
No, probably. I can't recall now. Probably not.
It seems an odd concern for the government itself to raise when, if the notes of the meeting of the 14th of December are to be accepted, responsible persons and persons involved in the trade who are best placed to judge costs weren't making that complaint to you at that meeting.
Well, I suppose they were the big players in the market. They had they would have liked. They'd been quite clear. They would have liked regulation. They would have liked it to have been a requirement for responsible people to use it. I suppose we wanted to bring together a broader church of people because the range of businesses that might want to use these, it was perfectly possible for businesses to do a suitable and sufficient risk assessment without using a UCAS accredited provider. This was really to see how we could support those who didn't feel confident that they could do it, to get somebody whose competency had been assured. And UCAS accreditation was kind of the gold-plated standard, possibly.
But you'd done no work to assess costs in any way, shape or form?
No.
Can you help us? What work had you done to consider whether a UCAS accreditation scheme would be likely to distort the market, and if so, to what extent?
No, none.
Amongst other things, weren't you ducking the basic problem that the unregulated market was prompting concerns for some time now about the competence of fire risk assessors, which would persist in the absence of an effective and, crucially, independent scheme to assure competence?
Well, I think we were working towards setting up something that businesses would businesses providing risk assessment services would choose to be a part of that scheme, so that there was a bigger market available for responsible people to choose from.
Can we go to paragraph 33 of your second witness statement, which is in page 10, at page 10 of the document that's on the screen? You say there, it's a few lines down from the top, or two down from the top, the competency of those qualified through and registered with the professional bodies where certification did not apply was considered at least equal, if not better. On what evidence did you conclude that registration with professional bodies was at least equal, if not better? Or was it simply an assertion of personal opinion?
I think it reflects the opinion of the professional bodies. I'm not sure I was saying that we considered, that they thought. I think that's saying that the professional bodies had an issue with that because they felt that their skills were equal to, if not better, and that by going down potentially a UCAS accreditation process, you'd be they'd not necessarily be able to be a part of that, and that they could provide high quality services to responsible people as they had been before, without the need to be UCAS accredited.
Wasn't the problem, and indeed the obvious problem with that registration with professional bodies wouldn't satisfactorily or obviously address the concerns that had been identified for some time now about competence in the market, which could be guaranteed, or better assured at least, by a UCAS accredited scheme?
Potentially, but not everybody was saying they wanted they didn't necessarily, it wasn't a universal commitment that everybody wanted a UCAS accredited scheme. It was one way to demonstrate. But there were other ways, and professionally competent people had gone through a certification and accreditation process.
Would you accept it's not so much what people want, the question is, what does the situation require? And here you'd had consistent reports of concerns about FRA competency, and the UCAS accredited scheme was the best available means of addressing those concerns. Would you accept that?
Yes.
Could I now turn on to a separate meeting, which is a lay cause meeting, which was held in January 2010. Lay cause is a somewhat unattractive acronym for the Local Authority Coordinators of Regulatory Services. And this meeting was held on the 19th of January 2010 to discuss the topic of fire safety in purpose-built flats, and the meeting was described as a round table to discuss the need for new guidance. Now, the minutes are at HOM quadruple 03853. Now, you attended the meeting. We can see from the second line of the list of attendees. Can you help the panel, first of all? What is lay cause? We know what it stands for, but what is it?
I think it was a directorate within the Local Government Association which brought together regulatory service, so environmental health, fire safety officers. I think it was the arm of the Local Government Association that had the specific brief to look at how regulatory services for which local authorities were responsible operated.
Thank you. Now, if we look at the foot of this first page, there are a number of issues raised and identified in bullet points. The first said that this lay cause non-prescriptive fire safety guidance was not designed to cover fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats. Had that always been your understanding of the position? Do you remember?
Yes, and no guidance on fire safety was prescriptive. The regulatory fire safety order had done away with prescription. All of the guidance was non-prescriptive.
And if we could turn to the second page, we see the following bullet point roughly halfway down the page, which says this: FRAs had been disappointed, so that's fire and rescue authorities, had been disappointed at the quality of some fire risk assessments. It suggested a lack of understanding on the part of some assessors, who then made false assumptions about the design and structure of the building. There are also questions about the extent of intrusive investigations being carried out. Now, surely you'd accept that this wasn't the first time that you'd been made aware of concerns about the quality / competence of fire risk assessors. Would you accept that?
No, I think that's talking about fire and rescue authorities had been disappointed in their enforcement capacity.
Yeah, but what does that say to you, Ms Upton, which may indeed be the answer to the question? There are concerns about how they're being carried out.
Yes.
Which reflects competence of those doing it.
Yes, but I suppose there are all, in the kind of regime that was set up, a self-compliance regime where you could choose how you delivered the outcome intended. There were always concerns from around the quality of risk assessment. The enforcing authorities had would always like more, and responsible people, may be doing the best. But yes, I agree, sorry.
So again, that wasn't the first time you'd heard concerns about fire risk assessments and the competency of those carrying them out. Do you accept that? I think you do.
Yeah.
Was this the first time you were made aware of what were described there as false assumptions being made by risk assessors in respect of the design and structure of buildings being inspected?
So these are talking about residential premises specifically, whereas I think everything I've said before was talking about until the Lakanal House fire, we were talking about, the raft of responsible people and persons to premises which were covered by. So this was focused specifically on fire safety in housing blocks, and I think until the Lakanal House fire, this hadn't been articulated so obviously that there were so many concerns around fire safety in purpose-built flats.
So it was the first. So was it the first time it'd been put with such clarity at this meeting?
Absolutely, yeah, I think so, definitely.
Was this the first time you'd heard reference to or questions about the extent of intrusive investigations?
Yes.
If we can turn to the 5th page in this document under discussion 3. And that's entitled, "Are there other residential fire safety issues you would like to raise that do not relate to the production of guidance?" And again, we see a series of bullet points. The second one says this, or asks this: do we fully understand the level of fire risk in purpose-built blocks? Is there a need for CLG to commission further research? Now, was this the first time you were aware or made aware of concerns about the understanding of the level of fire risk in purpose-built buildings? It's a slightly more particular question, the one I asked you earlier on.
Yes, I think so.
Can you remember now who raised that particular concern? Can you remember?
No.
Did you discuss that particular concern with any other policy colleague at the department?
Yes, I imagine I would have discussed it in the round rather than specifically, but with both Brian in Building Regulations and Pete Wise in the Chief Fire and Rescue Advisors Unit, and with housing colleagues, because of the responsibility under that housing legislation to ensure risk was in these premises.
You said you imagined you did so. Did you, or is it likely that you did so?
Yes, I can't recall it, but I will have either through email or through meetings. Yes.
Do you remember advising the Minister about this particular concern following the January 2010 meeting?
I remember advice was put up to ministers through Richard Longman, who's the housing. I'd need to check the date, I'm afraid, but certainly a submission reporting on lots of issues, which included a reference, I think, to the fact that we had met with the sector, both housing, fire safety, Chief Fire and Rescue Advisors Unit and Building Regulations had all been at this meeting, and that the sector had confirmed that more guidance would be helpful to address the concerns set out in this paper.
Thank you.
Advice certainly went.
Now, the next meeting with Jane Boys and stakeholders about fire risk assessment was on the 9th of March 2010. Again, you attended, and that is notable because it's the first meeting of the Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council.
Yeah.
Now, if we go to HOM 000-13530, we find a note of that meeting. You'll see at the top the list of attendees. Were they all the members of the FRAC?
I think they were the group that had gone forward after the meeting in December to say that they would lead the work on this. Then the FRAC became a bigger thing after this, I think, or
Okay.
a number more people. But yeah, they were definitely the core people leading the work.
Now, if we turn over the page to page 2, we see the heading at the very top of the page, Agreement. And it says this: the agreement reached on the 14th of December was reaffirmed in particular. And again, another series of bullet points which say this: it was desirable to have agreement of an overarching set of criteria focused on competency to undertake fire risk assessment. These criteria could provide a basis for individual schemes that could be accredited by UCAS, both for individual fire risk assessors and for risk assessment services provided by companies. It was important to maintain the momentum on this work now that a goal and working group had been established. Now, certainly looking at that minute at least, the goal in March 2010 remained UCAS accreditation as the basis for the competency scheme. Again, is that a fair reading?
Yes, or that the individual schemes would all share UCAS, okay, or would all, the individual constituent parts. UCAS accreditation was seen as
The basis?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, on the 10th of March, so the day after this meeting, you were sent an email from another attendee called Martin Russell Croucher, who's from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. That email chain can be found at HOM 000-13486. And if we can go to the second page of the chain, and there we have the start of it with Mr. Russell Croucher's email.
Can I just read this?
If we take it
Okay.
stage by stage, you'll see in the first paragraph he said this: I'm sure that you are as disappointed as I was by the step backwards. I suppose that is the price of democracy. Can you remember what the step backwards was?
That they would, I think it was that they would all.
If you don't remember, Miss Upton.
No, let's say I don't. No, I don't think I do remember actually.
So I don't want you to speculate. If you
No.
can't remember, say you can't remember. Can you remember, in broad terms, any sense of disappointment by the outcome of this meeting?
Yeah, I think it had been a very bad-tempered meeting. I think they hadn't reached. I think what had happened in December had fallen apart slightly. Whether that was over UCAS accreditation, I can't quite remember. But it felt like we had lost some ground, and I do remember it being a very difficult meeting, I think.
Some of that recollection, Ms. Upton, is reflected in what now follows. If we can look at the fifth full paragraph, which is about halfway down the page, Mr. Russell Croucher said this: in addition, I take issue with his assertion, I think that's Mr. Colin Todd, that the industry can sort this out. They haven't up until now, hence the proliferation of registers to date. You are probably not aware that I approached IFE when the RRO first came, so that's the order, and to propose a joint project to develop an industry register based on the Warrington UCAS certification subsequently developed. Colin, so that's Colin Todd, was then with IFE and shouted down this approach at that meeting in the same way as he was seeking yesterday to shout down the work already carried out so far by RICS, Warrington and IFE. Can you remember now what the gist of Mr. Todd's position was at this meeting in March 2010?
I think the gist was that there was a one-size-fits-all approach wasn't appropriate, or possibly.
So if we can go to the penultimate full paragraph of this email, Mr. Russell Croucher explains the following. I'm sorry that this is a bit of a moan, but the fire risk assessment sector is far too important to be influenced by one man's attempt to manipulate things to the advantage of whoever he is working for at the time. Now, taking that stage by stage, was Mr. Russell Croucher's preference for a national register of competent fire risk assessors?
Yes, I think so.
Had Mr. Todd suggested, to use the phrase, the industry can sort this out?
Yes. I think that was the upshot, that the industry really wanted to sort this out. The fact the industry couldn't agree initially.
And were you, and by that I mean the department, content to see whether the industry could sort itself out?
Oh yeah, we definitely wanted to, for them to have a go at sorting this out. Yes.
Now, in response to your email, we see at the top of page 1 a response from Jane Boys. And we can see she opened very useful response from Martin. I too pondered his decision to stick with the process and even offer a place to meet. But of course, they want to run a register. They presumably being RICS, I assume.
Yes.
He has his eye on a business opportunity. He's also well aware of the politics, in inverted commas, in this. Is that observation of Jane Boys fair, or did you consider it fair at the time?
I would have considered it fair at the time.
What were the politics in this?
I think it's politics with a small p, and I think it was a group of people who knew each other very, very well. It was a very small world, and they spent a lot of time arguing about the detail, and their interests were not necessarily aligned. It was one sector, but they all had a vested interest somewhere within the sector to promote a particular product or service, and it was very hard to get a consensus view on the single best thing to do, because there wasn't necessarily a single best thing to do. There was a range of things that you could do to deliver the same outcome.
Now, looking back at Jane Boy's email, she said this in the third paragraph. Meanwhile, my thoughts on some of your track changes on the meeting note, mainly let's keep it short, every word is one more to argue over. I tried to avoid mentioning things that were not agreed or outside the scope of the meeting. Is that, again, a useful insight into the nature of the discussions between these various parties, that one more word was something more to argue over?
Yeah, I think so.
Now, looking at the penultimate substantive paragraph of the email, Miss Boyce said this: the meeting was billed about process, not content, and it was totally unrepresentative. By unrepresentative, was Jane Boyce referring to the attendees or some other facet?
Oh, no, I think attendees.
And do you know what she meant when she said they were unrepresentative? Was it a point she'd made earlier to you?
No, I think in her stakeholder discussion, yes. No, I think they were all people. I think the attendees at the meeting were all people who had possibly more to gain than the broader. Yeah.
One thing that's striking, may I suggest to you, about this email correspondence is that it's a study in miniature of the various tensions that existed in the industry, that even where there was ostensibly widespread agreement over the solution, the feelings evidenced by this email change didn't augur well for the industry sorting out the problem for itself. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, but it was early days at this stage.
You say early days. We'll come on to it, but there's no impression at any time that you said something along the lines of, we'll give them 6, 9, 12 months to see whether they can sort it out, and then we'll take action. Did you ever articulate that to the industry at any time?
No.
Why?
I just don't think we thought. I think we thought we'd see where we got to. I mean, it wasn't. We didn't have an infinite. We just didn't have a goal, an end point in time. It was let's see how they get on. And I think at this meeting, or the one that came after it, there were things changed again that gave us more confidence that what had happened at this meeting could be addressed. You just might need more time. It was uncharted territory for us. I think we were feeling our way, and it felt premature to potentially start imposing deadlines that we really didn't have.
Is the reality, though, at the very least, did this exchange and what went on at the meeting, and I think you described it as difficult euphemistically, did it at least sow the seed of doubt that the industry was not going to find a clear, satisfactory, effective solution to the problems that everyone agreed existed?
No, I think it just set us back. I did think that it was never going to happen. I still think I was optimistic that something could be developed that would meet the aspiration of businesses.
Now, earlier on in your evidence, you referred to a submission being put up to ministers that was drafted by Richard Longman. Can I take you to that? And that can be found HOM 000 50088, and it's dated the 18th of March 2010, so 8 or 9 days after this meeting. Now, is this the submission that you had in mind when giving your earlier evidence?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Well, let's see as we go through. If you have any doubts, say so. But could we go to page 2 and look at paragraph 1? Thank you. Paragraph 1 says this: local authorities were asked to provide further information about high-rise housing blocks and the status of fire risk assessments. This submission summarises the analysis of responses and proposed actions. Is it right that local authorities had been asked in 2009 to provide this further information following the Lakanal fire?
Yes.
Did you contribute to Mr. Longman's submission?
No, I think I would have probably read it in draft and been aware of it, but I don't. But no, it was no.
He held the pen.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, if we can turn to the substance of the submission, and if we can go to the foot of page 5. And we can see at paragraph 19, Mr. Longman said this: One particular area where authorities asked for assistance was about the competence of people carrying out fire risk assessments. Colleagues in FRD, that's the Fire Resilience Directorate, I think, are carrying out a separate initiative to explore with the fire safety industry and professionals the scope for a national quality assurance scheme to be developed for those wanting to sell fire risk assessment services. Again, this would appear to be another piece of evidence that, and this time that local authorities were generally concerned about the competency of fire risk assessments. Would you accept that?
Yes.
And it echoed the views that were reported in the initial evaluation of March 2009. Would you accept that too?
Yes, it echoes some of the views from that evaluation, yeah.
Could we go to page 4 of your second witness statement, which is at HOM 0005082/4. And if we could look at paragraph 15, thank you. And in that paragraph, you explain this. On the 22nd of March 2010, so it's 4 days after the Longman submission, I provided a briefing to senior managers on the progress made to date on the work to address the competency recommendation from the FSO evaluation and on the next steps. Now, we have that briefing at HOM 0000735. There we go, and if we can turn to the bottom of page 2 of that document. We'll see in the final paragraph, it says this meeting, so that's the meeting on the 14th of December 2009, which we've been discussing, was successful in reaching an agreement on the way forward. Notably that there should be an overarching set of criteria focused on competency to undertake fire risk assessment. These criteria could provide a basis for individual schemes that could be accredited by UCAS for both individual fire risk assessors and for risk assessment services provided by companies. That comment there suggests that you considered that the criteria would form the basis of accreditation schemes which would or could be UCAS accredited. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, on the 23rd of March 2010, you were copied into an email from Jeff Deacon of Exova to Rhian Blackman, who you explained earlier was in your team. Now, we find that at CLG 1004295. And if we go to the foot of page 2, Mr. Deacon said this: as you are aware, Warrington Certification Limited operates a scheme for the certification of competent fire risk assessors, which is accredited by UCAS to the British standard. Following the presentation by Jane, so that's Jane Boys, given at the December review meeting, and the subsequent developments, you will also appreciate that there is little question that such certification of competence has to form the basis of any national recognition of competent fire risk assessors, whether this is the autonomous fire risk assessors, i.e. those that operate as individual consultants, or those that operate through corporate bodies. Now, did you agree at the time, so this is late March 2010, that the December meeting had left little question, to quote, that UCAS accredited competence had to form the basis of a national scheme?
It was certainly the preference, but yes, it was, quite clear.
And could we go to the top of page 2 in this chain, and we see an email from you to Jane Boys, Brian Martin and David Symes. Can you help us? Who is David Symes?
He was in one of our lawyers.
Thank you. Now, you write in the second paragraph of that email this: I'm pretty sympathetic to this and would like to reply confirming that this is indeed an option that is open to us and on which we will offer advice to ministers in due course, you meant to say there. Can you help us? Why were you sympathetic to the views expressed by Mr. Deacon?
because it reflected our starting point and what we wanted to achieve.
Now, you continue in that paragraph that you had, and I quote, no immediate plans to review the guidance, so it would be a while before such an amendment could be written in. Can you help us? What guidance were you referring to there?
That would be the guidance to responsible persons that was issued under Article 50 of the fire safety order by the department to help people. So it told them how to do a fire risk assessment for specific types of, or it offered advice on how to do a risk assessment for specific types of premises, and that would be the vehicle where if we were going to say, if this is beyond your competence, we could give advice on where they could go to find quality assured competent people.
Thank you. Now, can we go to CLG 1004360/4? Can I apologise about that intermittent buzzing? I hope it's not too distracting, Miss Upton.
No, it's not a fire alarm.
No. Could we look at the email that was sent on the 16th of June 2010 at 3:50 p.m. From Graham Wiles, the Managing Director of International Fire Consultants Limited. He'd emailed Brian Martin under the heading Identified Deficiencies in the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order and Possible Long-Term Savings. Am I right in understanding that Mr. Wiles was a member of the Competency Council?
Yeah.
Now, we can see that you're not copied in, but if we look at page 3, we can see that you were copied into the reply from Brian Martin to Graham Wiles, which was sent on the 29th of June at 3:27 p.m. Is that right? Is that a yes?
Yes, sorry.
If we can turn back to page 4 of Mr. Wiles's email, he wrote the following. It was good to see both yourself and Louise from CLG at the Fire Risk Assessment Competency meeting at LFB last week. Can you remember what was discussed at that particular meeting?
Could you just remind me of the date again?
It would be sometime in June 2010 at the LFB.
No, I'm afraid I can't remember.
The fourth paragraph down says this: most around the table at the meeting last week and listening to subsequent discussions have serious concerns that unless there is some compulsion or driver to comply, few will adopt any new system. With the exception perhaps of the bigger and more ethical building owners and operators, few will spend the money needed to use a qualified fire risk assessor, as schemes cost money, and therefore risk assessment fees will be relatively expensive for those in schemes and cheap from those cowboy providers not in approved schemes. Now, is it right that the view was that absent compulsion, few would adopt any new scheme? Are you able to assist us?
I think it was definitely the sector's view. I'm not sure we shared that view. We felt... I'm not sure we did share that view, but certainly there was an appetite within the industry for compulsion.
And because of the problem that Mr. Wiles identifies? Essentially, that unless there was compulsion, few would adopt it.
Yeah, and I think that's what we didn't necessarily share that view. We felt that the findings of the evaluation had suggested people were looking for to use services. They weren't looking to be compelled to use services.
Now, he goes on in the next paragraph to say, given the fact that we have been moving towards deregulation and functional building regulations for some time now, and the fact that we have recently lost 6 people in the Lakanal House fire and seen several near misses in the recent past, surely we should not leave corrective regulation until we have a really serious fire and losses, as we saw at Bradford and Windsor. Government must create some form of regulatory or legislative driver. Signposting is not and will not be sufficient. Do you know what near misses were being referred to here?
Well, Bradford related to the Bradford Football Stadium fire, and Windsor was the fire at Windsor.
At the castle?
At the castle. Lives weren't lost, I think, at Bradford possibly, but certainly not at Windsor.
Are you able to help us as to why the Bradford and Windsor fires may have related to the question of fire risk assessors and accrediting their competence?
No.
Now, if we can go to the top of page 5, Mr. Wiles says this. Firstly, just below the top I should say, firstly, the purpose of establishing levels of competency and mapping them to risks was to try and ensure that people only operate within their proven abilities. If we let the competence debate drift towards one level of minimum criteria for competence, as I suspect many will try and propose, we will do nothing toward preventing the man in a white van extinguisher brigade from undertaking more complex risk assessments. Reputable fire safety and engineering companies are employing experienced and qualified staff, and yet work goes to cheap, unqualified and inexperienced technicians. Now, at the time, what did you make of his concerns that setting minimum criteria for competence would not prevent the man in a white van extinguisher brigade?
I think I was persuaded by the view that it was a very difficult thing to establish. One of the key things about competence is knowing when you reach the limit of it, and if that was, and where you needed to get more additional support. And I think that was one of the key objectives of a competency scheme, was that people would know when they'd reached the limit of their, to be a member of an accredited scheme, you would almost be understanding when you'd reached the limit of your competence, so you would give advice to the building owner that they needed different technical support. It would get away from the man in the white van approach, because you would have certified that you were competent up to a point, and then the market would then, I suppose, create different levels of competency. So it felt that the first place to start was to get people at understanding when they'd reached the limit of their competence.
So, in a nutshell, you were not immediately persuaded of the view that setting minimum criteria would eliminate, to use his pejorative phrase, the white van brigade? I'm trying to understand your view.
No, but you would be having people whose competency had been assessed. You would be, rather than it being a complete free-for-all, you would have more companies with an independent assessment of competency than just the man in the white van.
There would be a baseline.
Yeah.
Now, could we go to page 1 in the chain? And there's an email halfway down page 1, sent on the 1st of July 2010, and you sent a proposed draft to Brian Martin. You also copied in Ken Knight. Again, is this an example of an issue on which you'd seek Brian Martin's advice?
Yes, I think so. It was. Yes, it was.
There's an impression, and please say if this is wrong, that not only did you seek Mr. Martin's advice, you tended to defer to it. Is that fair?
I took it very seriously. I clearly respected Brian's advice. He was independent by virtue of being a civil servant. The people I could speak to about fire safety and get an unbiased, impartial, independent view were few and far between. So, yes.
But being a civil servant, it means that you are free from the interests that concern business, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that individual is objective or impartial. That individual will have his or her own views, won't they?
Yes, and I was interested in Brian's views on these questions because it helped calibrate, I suppose, my own thinking, and the same with Ken. They both knew way more about fire safety and the sector and than me.
Can you remember an instance when you didn't accept or prefer Mr. Martin's advice on an issue concerning the competence of fire risk assessors?
No, but I think we both were working within the same policy environment and had access to the same. No, I can't.
So if we can look at page 2 of this email chain, and really the third substantive paragraph down, it's the one that begins clearly. And you say this in your draft response that you were seeking Mr. Martin's views on. Clearly, there are a wide range of interests and viewpoints represented within the sector on what the criteria against which to assess the competency of a risk assessor should look like. Bottoming this out and getting a majority to agree competency criteria has to be the first step along the way to the development of a national register or scheme which can be independently quality assured via accreditation with UCAS. Again, in July 2010, it looks as if the national scheme or register with UCAS accreditation was the end point. Is that right?
Yeah.
Now, if we can go back to the top of page 1, we see Mr. Martin's response to you. Hi, Louise, we spoke. And then he goes on to say, further down, in the second line of this opening paragraph, the only point I would change is in the 7th paragraph, which is the one we just looked at. This implies that there would be only one national scheme and that this would be UCAS accredited. I took the expectation from industry is that there would be a number of schemes, probably, but not necessarily UCAS ones, all using the same standard. Now, that doesn't necessarily reflect what had been discussed and agreed on the 14th of December 2009. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Did Mr. Martin's understanding of the expectation of industry accord with your own?
Yeah, I think there was. Yes, I think it did.
But that is contrary to the consistent theme of the discussions since 2009, certainly December 2009, about UCAS accreditation forming the basis of schemes.
Yes,
or
I
a
think.
scheme.
Yes, but I think there wasn't that consensus within the industry, and when I was writing back, it was a way of not being. Not putting a pragmatic way through, perhaps.
That might be so, but did Mr. Martin's email prompt a change in the direction away from a single national UCAS accredited scheme?
A single, yes, yes. I think I'd have to see what my actual reply was.
It's just, I'm more concerned here to see what Mr. Martin's views were on it. We can go to it if you'd like, and we can go to HOM 000 38269. And what we can go to, if we go to the second paragraph on page 2, so I can direct you closely to the paragraph we're concerning about it clearly. And what you said here was there are a wide range of interests and viewpoints represented within the sector on what the criteria against which to assess the competency of a risk assessor should look like. bottoming this out and getting a majority to agree has to be the first step along the way to the development of registration schemes which we can all recognise. Now, what is missing there is the statement of the end goal, namely the step along the way to the development of a national register or scheme, singular, which can be independently quality assured via accreditation with UCAS. Would you accept that?
To a point, but then I had, it looks like, attached the outcome of the meeting, which had been the note of the meeting.
But it's interesting that you did drop, and I can put both.
Yes.
You had dropped that reference to a national UCAS accredited scheme, hadn't you?
In this email, although it would have still been in those notes of the meeting.
But what we're looking at here is that it appears that you changed the draft response as a direct result of what Mr. Martin had written to you. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And what has been clearly dropped is the reference to a national register or scheme underpinned by UCAS accreditation. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, turning to the next document, in July 2010, you put up a submission to Bob Neal, who's then the Fire Minister, on the subject of regulation for commercial fire risk assessors. And that submission can be found at HOM:000884. What you say there in paragraph 2 is this: the submission seeks confirmation that you are content with our current approach of encouraging the sector itself to address business concerns, that some form of quality assurance for commercial risk assessors would be helpful, and that the sector itself is best placed to affect business confidence and improve fire safety outcomes. Businesses are unlikely to welcome the burden of further regulation in this area, and any new requirement in this area would undermine the fundamental principle of the regulatory reform fire safety order, which is to allow those best placed to understand the risks to manage them down to an appropriate level as they see fit. Now, what it appears is that you are not now advocating the development of a national register of scheme underpinned by UCAS accreditation. Is that right?
Not at this stage. I think we've broken it down to be more, to take it in stages. I think, yes.
Well, looking at that summary, this is what you're putting up to the Minister. You are laying down factors there which are unqualified, reference to businesses not welcoming further regulation, reference to undermining fundamental principles of the legislation. It is clear, isn't it, that in July 2010, you are no longer advocating a national register or scheme underpinned by UCAS accreditation. Is that right, or am I wrong?
That's right.
That development, put neutrally, appears to have been prompted by Brian Martin's email that we recently considered. Is that right?
I'm not sure as my thought process took it to that sense. It seemed more an issue to keep the sector together and not, I suppose, put red rags up. It was kind of let them see where they get to. It was kind of, I do think it's more that it had been parked for now while they focused around developing a standard of competency. But I can't.
There does appear to be a chronological consistency between Mr. Martin's email and the suggested change in his response to Graham Wiles, and, again put neutrally, a downgrading of the aspiration away from a single national register with UCAS accreditation. Now, simply because something came after it doesn't mean it was caused by it. But here, there does appear to be a marked change of view which followed close on Mr. Martin's email. Did Mr. Martin's email at least have an influence on the thinking that's represented by this submission?
Yes, probably. Yes. Yes.
Now, can we turn to paragraph 8 at the bottom of page 2 of this submission? And we see there you advise the Minister as follows. Although agreement on the way forward was reached in December and reasserted a meeting in March, this may be fragile. There are a number of vested and narrow interests at play. Are the vested and narrow interests those which you referred to earlier?
Yes.
In paragraph 9, you go on to say this. The next meeting of the Competency Council, under the chairmanship of CFOA, is scheduled for the 17th of September. It aims to consider the progress made by a smaller group of practitioners, including Graham Wiles, who volunteered to work on the development of competency criteria. In the light of the outcome of that meeting, we aim to provide ministers with further advice on the progress being made by the sector and, if necessary, to consider whether other options may exist for delivering the kind of a quality-assured accredited scheme or register of commercial party risk assessors that business is looking forward. Now again, on one reading, that seems to be further indication of the move away from the single national register underpinned by UCAS. Is that a correct reading of what you are commending to the Minister? If I can put it differently, this paragraph is not characterised by any specific reference.
To UCAS, no. So clearly, that's right.
Could we go to your second statement, which we can find at HOM 0005082/5, and if we could look at paragraph 16. You explained there that the suggested response to John Bercow, who's then MP for Buckingham, in whose constituency I think Graham Wiles' company was incorporated, reflected both the government's deregulatory principles and business's lack of appetite for increased regulation, and its adherence to the principles of localism, which place the responsibility for leading and delivering change with the fire safety industry itself. I've touched upon this earlier, but at this stage, what was the evidential basis for your conclusion that business had a lack of appetite for increased regulation? The reason I ask that is that that lack of appetite, was not obvious from Mr. Wiles' email.
No, well, as I think I said before, the fire safety industry, businesses in the fire safety industry were very keen for more regulation, and he was a part of that constituency, whereas the wider thrust of business, they hadn't, and the whole policy environment was for less regulation, and it certainly hadn't come through the evaluation or subsequent chats with the CBI or any business representative of responsible persons that more regulation was desirable in any way. Lots of...
But that's not a sensible question to ask them, is it? If you ask businesses, would you like more regulation in a vacuum, they're bound to say no. If you ask them, would you like to have a regulated scheme to enable you to find a competent fire risk assessor with confidence, you might get a different answer.
Yes, and we had that answer that some businesses were looking for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, had you had any responses from industry generally that they would not welcome that?
No, no. But we hadn't done any tests, I suppose. That would have, yes. No, we hadn't had that, but there would have, I suppose, there'd have been a cost, there was a complex set of questions behind that, I suppose we would have had to go into, and we didn't.
So to tell ministers that business doesn't want any more regulation is somewhat beside the point, isn't it?
Well, I suppose so, but we were in a very deregulatory environment at this point.
Well, that's another question.
Yeah.
The minister might say they might like it, but they can't have it. But that's a different question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
On that note, sir, it's an opportune point to break.
Is it? Right, thank you. Well, Ms. Upton, it's time we all stop for some lunch. So we'll break there. We'll come back, please, at 2:00. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're away from the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 2:00.
Thanks, sir.